Look, thank you very much for your patience, everybody. And again, welcome to this webinar. Jamie, you can just check to make sure that people can see me if that's okay from your side. Fantastic. Okay. What I'm going to do now is just provide a very brief introduction to myself and my background. By way of background, I've been working in mental health for almost 4 decades. I'm a clinical psychologist and researcher. I'm a professor at Macquarie University, which is based in Sydney, but also an adjunct professor at Curtin University. And I'm also scientific advisor of a national digital psychology service called MindSpot. Now, in terms of my last, 2 decades of work, I've been heavily involved in clinical trials and clinical practice. And you can see some statistics and numbers there. But I was recognised last year with an Order of Australia, which was very humbling, but really, as you can appreciate, reflects the work and efforts of many, many people, as well as, of course, my family. But my professional mission in the last 2 decades has really been about how we can improve access to psychological services using technology. And you can see under outputs and MindSpot, we've been able to deliver evidence-based psychological care to more than 300,000 Australians, with some quite a large number of additional number of people here in WA via MindSpot GP. But in the last 10 years or so, I've become increasingly focused on how we can build knowledge and resources in the general community to help people look after their own mental health. And there are a number of reasons why I've been focused on this new mission. And I think we all recognise from media reports, and I'm going to show you some headlines from the last 12 months, most groups working in this field recognise that there are significant challenges with the mental health system the way it is. There are multiple reports about an increase in prevalence rates, particularly for certain populations. Waiting lists are significant, and many people are struggling to navigate the mental health system. Now, if we recall back to the COVID days, we all appreciate that COVID was enormously challenging for our community, and it tested our physical and our psychological resilience in many ways. But one thing which COVID did teach many people is that our mental health is as important as our physical health. Now, we reflected a lot at MindSpot during COVID about the kinds of messages we could share with people about their health. And when we think about our physical health, it's probably important to recognize that there are lots of things that people know that they can do each day to improve their physical health. And here are some examples. Brush your teeth twice a day, exercise 3 times a week, walk 10,000 steps. Now, we all know that information. It's part of the common consciousness. We may not follow it, but we do know it. And I think one of the things we've learned about that type of advice and why it sticks, if you like, in the common consciousness is that advice like that often has 2 parts. It has an action or something we want people to do, a behavior, and it also has a frequency, how often people should do those actions. And what was interesting during COVID was reflecting that we actually don't have similar advice for mental health. Now, when I started training in mental health many years ago, and I suspect many people on this call probably had a similar experience, but the models of psychology and psychiatry tended to emphasize the role of biology or genetics, as well as the role of environment and context, as more important than behavior in terms of impacting our mental health. Now, that flies in the face of research studies, and I think for many of us, personal experience, which has shown that there are many actions which we can take each day that affect our mental health. Practicing mindfulness, engaging with loved ones, practicing gratitude or kindness, or being engaged in activities we enjoy. Now, What was interesting when we started this body of work was reflecting that although there is some really good research out there showing that different kinds of actions can help our mental health, there wasn't much literature which had compared the actions. So the question, which actions are most important, had mostly been unanswered. And importantly, there was very little information about how often people should do the actions in order to obtain benefit. That is the tipping point or frequency required before people would notice a benefit. So our body of work really has tried to identify which actions are most helpful and how often we need to do those actions in order to feel better. And our thinking has been that if we can answer those questions, we potentially have an opportunity to develop new psychological treatments, importantly, new education campaigns, and we may even develop strategies for increasing community resilience, which is a goal we're all striving towards. So that's led to our work on the Big Five. And so today, what I'm going to do very briefly is introduce the Big Five and then talk about the evidence behind the Big Five. But importantly, I'm going to focus on number three, which is how you can use the Big Five in your own life and potentially with the people around you, including the clients that you work with. Now, just by way of background, we've actually conducted quite a lot of work on the Big Five. This is a summary of some of our published studies. If you search the literature, you won't find the term Big Five. It's really a marketing phrase, which we know is a simple way for people to understand some of the key messages. In our scientific research, the Big Five is called the things you do. So if you're searching for things you do on Google Scholar, you'll see many of our articles come up. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce the Big Five. I'm going to do that quite quickly. Now, I'm then going to talk about the evidence. I'm not going to go through all of these studies. I'm going to give you a quick summary, but I'm very happy to share these papers with anybody who's interested or answer any questions as we progress through. So without further ado, let's introduce the Big Five. Now, can I ask you to refer to the Big Five self-assessment checklist? Now, you may have noticed in the invitation to this webinar that there was a link to this PDF, and we've included it in the chat for this meeting as well. So please download that and just have that on the side as you listen to the next few minutes of updates or comments. Now, this self-assessment checklist, I'm promoting it because it's proven to be a really simple way of educating people about the Big Five, but also helping people recognize how often they're doing the Big Five and where they might increase the types of actions which they're doing. Now, I'll just explain the checklist to you. On the left-hand column there, under activities, you'll notice 5 categories, and these are the Big Five. The first are meaningful activities, and I'll talk more about these later. The second are healthy thinking. The third are goals and plans. The fourth are healthy routines. And the fifth are social connections. In the next column, you'll see examples. And then in the next columns, which are color-coded, you'll see that we ask people to try to estimate how often in the last 7 days they did each of these actions. Now, the color coding is really important, and I'll talk more about that. But as you can imagine, green is good. Amber is in a domain where people probably need to just be a bit mindful about the actions they're doing. And if people are in the red zone, we do encourage people to do more. Now, how did we come up with the Big Five? Well, firstly, they're all evidence-based skills, but we were much more systematic than that. I won't go into details except to say that when we first began this body of work, we identified more than 500 different types of actions that had been linked to mental health. Over the course of surveys with more than 6,000 Australian adults, a general sample of the population, we asked people how often they did many different kinds of actions, and we asked questions about their mental health. We used validated clinical measures of depression, anxiety, satisfaction with life. We asked people a whole series of demographic questions. And what we discovered was that these 5 factors, the big five, meaningful activities, healthy thinking, goals and plans, healthy routines, and social connections, were by far the 5 domains of action which were the most strongly linked with mental health outcomes. Now, we also tested whether these 5 were relevant or the most relevant, depending on gender, age, or other characteristics of socioeconomic background, such as employment status or ethnicity. And consistently, these 5 were the most important. Now, that's well and good, but really the secret sauce with the big 5 is frequency. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But what we found was a very strong relationship between how often people do the big 5 and their mental health. So that's a very brief introduction to the big 5. And again, I'm very happy to talk more about that in a moment. But what I really want to do now is I want to share the evidence behind the big 5 and also acknowledge that there are lots of different ways of collecting evidence and lots of different types of evidence. And I'm going to share evidence from surveys. I'm going to share evidence from clinical trials, and I'm going to share evidence from the results when the big 5 is actually used in clinical services. So let's begin with evidence from surveys. Now, we have given that big 5 checklist, which we've talked about, to more than 21,000 Australians. And what we've found is a really strong relationship between how often people do the big 5 and their symptoms of mental health. So what I'm going to do now is show you, it's a bit of a complex graph, but it shows you the relationship between symptoms of depression, we use the PHQ-9 measure, versus how often people reported they did the big 5. So I'm going to first show you the results for people who reported that they did the big 5 every day. So out of the 21,000 people, about 16% reported that they did the big 5 every day. And you can see here the proportion of people who either had no or mild symptoms of depression, so that's the green bar, people who had moderate symptoms, so the yellow bar, and people who had moderate or severe symptoms of depression. So you can see that if people reported they were doing the big 5 every day, they mostly had no symptoms or mild symptoms. But if you look at the checklist, you'll notice the next category or next frequency count is people who reported doing the big 5 to 6 times per week. And you can see that there's still a really high proportion of people who report no or mild symptoms, whereas those with symptoms, they start to creep up. But as we go down the chain, as we go down the frequency with which people report that they do the big 5, you can see that the proportion of people who report no or mild symptoms eventually gets down to 0. When people report that they're never doing the big 5, this is on the very far right section of the graph here, you can see that the majority, about 97, 98% of people who report they're never doing the big 5 have moderately severe or severe symptoms. Now, this pattern of results is the same regardless of age or gender, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. And these results are being replicated by our collaborators and colleagues overseas, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So in summary, the evidence from surveys shows the strong correlation, but you have to be skeptical. And if you are wondering about this data, you should, because surveys are point-in-time correlations. They don't talk about causality. We, of course, have explored causality through clinical trials. And there are 2 main findings which I want to share with you. And the first is that when people who are struggling with symptoms of depression and anxiety are prompted to do the big 5 more often, their mental health improves. Here's an example. About 3 years ago, we completed a randomized controlled trial where we recruited almost 350 members of the public across Australia. These are people who are struggling with symptoms of depression and anxiety. And we randomly allocated people to either a control group who we monitored their symptoms, or an intervention group where we gave them information about the big 5. And then for 4 weeks, every weekday for 4 weeks, we sent them a very simple SMS message, nudging them to do more of the big five. Now, what we found was that there was a significant difference between the two groups after those 4 weeks. But importantly, even after 3 months after that, so without doing any more, without sending any more messages, the people in the intervention group who'd received the SMS nudges on a daily basis had reduced their symptoms by 28% compared to the control group. This is a significant finding. And this really indicated that just by nudging people to do more of the big five, people's behavior changed, but importantly, their habits changed. So they were able to sustain those gains for more than 3 months. Now, there's more evidence, of course. Recently, we've completed a clinical trial. This time, we recruited just over 300 Australian health professionals. Now, we picked that group for two reasons. Firstly, health professionals are usually overworked and underpaid. And secondly, they often spend so much time giving to other people that they struggle to actually manage their own mental health and their own physical health. So we recruited over 300 Australian health professionals. And I was one of the researchers directly on this trial. And it only took 3 weeks to recruit this number of people. Now, we followed exactly or more or less the same protocol. So for 4 weeks, we sent people daily SMS messages. And this time we saw a significantly larger reduction of 40% after 3-month follow-up. The results are really quite profound and quite stunning. So the first message is that when people are prompted to do the big five more often, their mental health improves. That's that first finding from our clinical trials. The second quite significant finding is that when healthy people are asked to restrict the big five, their mental health can rapidly deteriorate. I know this is an unusual question, and obviously all of these trials had ethical approval and lots of safety protocols. But this was an important question because it's not a question that's normally asked about techniques for improving mental health. But what we did was we started by running a very small pilot trial. I ran this in 2023, published in 2024, and we recruited 12 healthy volunteers from across Australia. And for 2 weeks, we asked them to restrict health, and they did the big five. We did that very simply. We asked them to look at that checklist, which I've been showing you or talking about. And all of these people, because they were healthy, they were in the green zone for all of the actions. We asked them to move to the red zone. That is, don't stop doing anything, just restrict how often you do the big five. And what we found was that within 2 weeks, the majority of people had deteriorated. Their mental health had got worse. They were showing signs of mild or moderate or even moderately severe symptoms of depression. Now, initially, we were going to work with up to 25 people, but after working with 12, it was apparent that everybody who restricted deteriorated. Now, we went back to the drawing board after that trial, and then we went back to our ethics board and said, look, we need to test this in a randomized controlled trial. So about a year and a half ago, we recruited 70 healthy volunteers, and we allocated them to one of two groups, either a control group who we just monitored or a intervention group, and we followed the same protocol. So we asked those healthy people to restrict for 2 weeks how often they did the big five. And what we found was that within 2 weeks of restricting the big five actions, 70%, over 70% had deteriorated. Now, the good news is everyone had recovered within 4 weeks of resuming the big five actions. But what was quite profound working clinically, and I was one of the clinicians on this trial, and there were a lot of safety protocols. We interviewed people every week. We were trying to learn as much as we could from people's experience. But here is what some of the people reported. People had a lot of insight. People reported after a week of poor sleep and not doing good things or things which were good for them, I was getting sad and anxious. Another person said, I felt like a different person. When we think about our own experience, when we can't do the things we enjoy, we do notice there's a shift. But when we do work with people clinically who are experiencing symptoms of depression or anxiety, they often report, I'm not the same person. Another person reported, getting back to normal was harder than I expected. And that's a critical message. most people reported that when they were trying to resume the big five actions and get back to normal, they knew the things they needed to do, but most reported it was harder than they expected. And there's some other comments there about the importance of basic routines. After the study, most people said they had learned an enormous amount about their own mental health. Okay, so just in summary then, from our clinical trials, we've found two key pieces of information. Firstly, when people who are struggling are prompted to do the big five, more often their mental health improves. And secondly, when healthy people restrict the big five, their mental health can rapidly deteriorate. Now, I won't go into too much detail about the last level of evidence, which is evidence from clinical services. That is routine clinical care. I think this is very important, probably more important than a lot of randomized controlled trials. But very briefly, what we found is the Big Five also works in mental health clinics. So our colleagues in Canada, who we work with very closely, they worked with a group of 48 people. This is a published trial, of course. And what they did was, rather than send SMS messages, they sent daily emails for 8 weeks, nudging the big five actions. And what you can see there is the change in symptoms of depression in blue bars in that graph on the right, while the frequency of big five actions increased. So the trial lasted for 8 weeks, and then they followed people up 20 weeks as well. As you can see, the gains were sustained, again indicating that the shifts in behavior can actually result in habits which change. Now, very briefly, we're also using the Big Five at MindSpot. There are more than 1,500 people receiving daily SMS messages. And what we're finding is that pretty much the same findings. We're just preparing a paper at the moment. So what we found is that the Big Five seems to be a really simple way to talk to people about mental health. And Health Direct, many of you know, is a really large telehealth provider in Australia, adopted the Big Five a couple of years ago. Medicare Mental Health are promoting the Big Five. It's great that WAFA have come on board and are supporting the Big Five. And I really also need to acknowledge WAFA's ongoing support with the Big Five over a number of years. There's a lot of media interest in this work as well. As I mentioned, we're using the Big Five at MindSpot. I'm giving weekly talks at the moment to different groups. Recently, we were down in Bunbury giving a really engaging talk to a number of people there. This webinar series is part of that. A few weeks ago, I was in Sydney and invited to give a talk to a whole group of school principals and guidance counsellors, and I believe there are now 50 schools or high schools in that part of Sydney who are going to be adopting the Big Five. And there's numerous other talks we're giving, but there's a lot of interest internationally. If I understand correctly, the Big Five is now being translated into more than 10 languages, and it's being used by at least, or groups in at least 17 countries. And I'm working closely with quite a number of groups, including a group in Bergen, which is a city in Norway, who are trialing the Big Five at the moment. All right, okay. Thank you very much for your patience. That's a lot of information. Let me summarize that, and then we'll move on to the main part of today's webinar. But let's just reflect, what does all of this mean? Well, the key messages are, just like our physical health, there are things we can do each day to improve our mental health. Now, our results show that some actions are more important than others. We call those the Big Five. But as I said, if you've got your Big Three or Big 10 and they work for you, then keep doing those. But our results show that restricting the Big Five, that is, if people do the Big Five less often, it can trigger symptoms. Conversely, if we're struggling, doing the Big Five more often can improve our mental health. And what's important is that there's a tipping point. If people are doing the Big Five at least 4 to 5 days each week, we know their mental health is likely to be in a healthy range. And a really critical point is that the Big Five are important, regardless of culture or background or age. So again, thank you for your patience. I appreciate that. That bit was quite heavy. I'd like to move on to the main part of the presentation, which is about how you can use the Big Five in your own life. And this is an interactive part of the presentation. And what I'm about to do is I'm going to go through each of the big five and explain what they're actually like. And when we work with people, what they tell us they do in terms of the big five and why they're important. And then I'm going to invite you to share your own ideas. It's a bit of brag and steal, that is sharing what works for you and hopefully inspiring other people. So let's begin with meaningful activities. That's the first of the big five. And these are really actions which give people a sense of accomplishment or satisfaction or joy. And simply, they're actions which are fun and engaging. Now, what's really important is that they're meaningful to you. Now, they might be your personal mission, or it might just be your way of relaxing, but it's critical to reflect on the things that are important for you. And what I often say to people is that these are the things which we often stop doing when life gets busy. And we've all had that experience where we find ourselves perhaps in a bit of a rut or turning our wheels over, and we find that we've stopped doing some of the things we really enjoy. So what are some examples of meaningful activities? Well, some examples of relaxing things that people tell us they often do include reading or listening to music or watching a good show or even enjoying a glass of wine, obviously in moderation. But there are things which people also do which are more active. So hobbies, cooking, cleaning, building, fishing, and so on and so on. But there are also actions or activities which are meaningful activities, which are about someone's purpose or someone's mission. That might include learning something new. It might include volunteering. It might include some other form of service to your community or to people around you. And what I'm going to ask you to do now is I'm going to ask you to use a tool called Slido. Now, Slido is an interactive tool. And what you'll see there on the left-hand side is a QR code, and you can scan that with your phone. But you also see a URL. So you're welcome to either scan the QR code or use the URL slido.com. And if I can invite people to do that, and then at the prompt, if you can enter in the code BIG5. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like to ask you to answer the question at the top, meaningful activities. What do you love to do and may have stopped doing? And what gives you joy and satisfaction? And I'm just going to note that we were testing this a few moments ago, and our hosts for this webinar have shared some ideas already. But I do encourage everybody to have a go. And I should say this is all anonymous. I have no idea who people are. But what we're going to do is we're going to take screenshots of everyone's answers, and I'll pop them into the PowerPoint, which will then circulate. So this is really, as I mentioned, an opportunity to reflect on the things that you do that you enjoy doing, but also maybe share your ideas so other people can learn from them. So I've got some great ideas: playing my instrument, hosting dinner at my home, writing with my fountain pens, Pilates. I'll give people a couple of moments to do this. This is great. Okay. Painting and gardening, spending time in nature. So think about the things, as I say, that you may have stopped doing. What are the things that you really enjoy? Oh, well, look at these brilliant ideas. Walking on the beach, walking with friends, yoga, music, dinner parties. Okay, that's fantastic. All right, we've got some lovely ideas, everybody. Thank you very much. Now, what I'm going to do is just reflect for a moment on those meaningful activities. These are excellent. So, if you see something that inspires you, can I encourage you just to make a note of it in your calendar? Just a bit of a gentle reminder for yourself. But let's move on to the second of the big five, which is about healthy thinking. Now, another way of thinking about this is that it's a way of staying grounded. Now, why is this important? Well, as you all know, we all have thoughts on a regular basis. Thoughts are the things we say in our own heads. They're our internal dialogue. But as you probably well know, when we feel depressed or anxious or even overwhelmed, It's common for people to have self-critical thoughts. For example, I can't do this, I'm not good enough. Now, if those thoughts become too prevalent, if we start to listen to that voice, that internal dialogue, and bear in mind our internal dialogue is not always accurate, and when we're feeling down and stressed, it's often inaccurate and certainly unhelpful. But it can get to the point where we might even be disrespectful towards ourselves. Now, healthy thinking involves a number of things. Again, that theme of staying grounded is really important. Healthy thinking involves accepting that things aren't perfect. We're not perfect. The world isn't perfect. It's often important just to try to do the best that we can. And that means keeping things in perspective, particularly when things are challenging or go wrong, and critically treating ourselves with respect. And that means talking to ourselves in the same way we would talk to other people. So, for example, leading yourself and reminding yourself to say things like, I'm doing the best I can. It's hard, but I've got this. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is go back to Slido, and I'm going to ask you to answer these two questions. First question is, what would you say to a younger version of yourself who is having a difficult time? The second question related to the first is, what advice would you give to reassure, to motivate, or inspire them? What words of wisdom would you share? This too shall pass. You got this. Excellent. Those are wonderful examples. Uh, it gets better. Just hang in there. So again, the questions are, what would you say to a younger version of yourself who is having a difficult time? Now, what advice would you give to reassure, motivate, or inspire them? Experience the world. It gets better. You've got this. When you look back on this, it won't be so important. That's fantastic. You're stronger than you think. Okay, brilliant. Now, can I again encourage you, if there's any words or comments that resonate with you here, just make a note of this. Again, I'll make a copy of this available to everybody. Okay, these are great examples of healthy thinking. Let's move on to the third of the big five, which are about goals and plans. Now, I really like these because they define our intentions for the future. And goals and plans are really important because they give us something to look forward to. And that's important because they stop us from dwelling on past problems. And we all know that's what we tend to do when things are difficult. And having something to look forward to, something that we're working towards, helps us to stay motivated and energized. Now, when people think about goals and plans, they often think about goals and plans in relation to career or education. But I've got a list here of other examples, other parts of our lives that you may want to consider, relationships, family, our health and fitness, our financial health, our hobbies, our interests, goals which might be around travel or change or spirituality or our values or community or environment. And bear in mind that goals and plans can be short or long term. So again, let's go back to Slido. Can you please make a note of one thing you want to achieve today? That may seem trivial, but it's really important to have short-term goals as well as longer-term goals. And what's one thing you want to achieve this month? Okay, have a healthy meal. That's a good one. Attend webinar. Woohoo! Go for a 30-minute walk. That's great. Go for a run. Stop talking myself down and being the butt of my own jokes. Great. Go to Bali with family. That's great. Be truly present with my kids. That's gorgeous. That's great. Go for a beach swim. Book a trip. All right, these are fantastic. All right, so again, if you see something that resonates with you, please make a note of it. Um, uh, and again, I'll be making these available. Now, these are really good examples of goals and plans, both short and long term. But let's move on to healthy routines, which is the fourth of the big five. As we've talked to people, and look, we've had more than 25,000 people use the big five and provide advice, but I'm starting to think we probably need to rename it as healthy rituals, because these are things which set people up for the day or week, that they're foundational activities. And what's important to note is that these are actions we initially have to focus on doing, we have to pay attention to, we do intentionally, but after a while, they become automatic. Now, here are some examples. So there are physical examples of healthy routines. So healthy sleep routines, turning off our devices, getting to bed at a reasonable hour, making sure we get enough sleep, having breakfast, having healthy portions, maintaining some degree of physical activity. But also there are examples around home routines. And a lot of people find these really cleansing. That is decluttering, cleaning your home, home admin, making time on a regular basis to do this. There are also routines which are about our engagement with others. I find a really critical one at home. We have teenage kids, is dinner time. We can't do it every week because people are flying left, right, and centre for different extracurricular activities. But at least 3 times a week, getting everybody to sit down, even if they don't want to initially, and having dinner together. There's initially 5 minutes of grumbles, but then there's a magic period or a transition where all of a sudden people realize they don't like each other, and we have real conversations. And it's a really beautiful way just to keep people grounded. But there are also routines around having regular breaks. And a lot of people who struggle with burnout actually struggle with regular breaks. That is, breaks during the day, breaks on during the week, and even taking time outside. So not the last, but the second to last slido is, what regular routines help you stay well, happy, and healthy? So if you're struggling here, think about the last time you felt like you were the best version of yourself. What were the things that you were doing on a regular basis? Let's get some ideas going. Daily stretching, fantastic. Yoga, space, tidy, love, clutter-free, less alcohol, more laughter. That's a good one. What other things do you do, or routines have you found that help you stay well, happy, and healthy? What about sleep? Simply living, that's a beautiful one. Okay. Look, in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is move on to the last of the big five. Do feel free to keep sharing your insights here. But the last of the big five are social connections. And as you know, most people find it incredibly rewarding to have a sense of connection, belonging, and um, time with other people. It's incredibly validating. But it's really important to note that people have different social needs. I often joke when I share the slide, because my wife has about 1,000 friends, and I'm a typical middle-aged male who has 5 friends, including our dog and my kayak. I'll probably have more than that. But the key point is, different people have different social needs. But it's quite common when we're under pressure, when we're feeling stressed or down, to forget who's in our social networks. So here are some gentle reminders. We reflect on our own families. You'll be able to recognize that we actually have layers and layers of connections. We're not just parents or children. We're siblings, we're uncles, we're aunts, we're nieces or nephews and grandparents. Even when we think about our friends, it's not just one type. It's a continuum. We have besties or buddies, or we have people in the social network, whatever that might look like. We have acquaintances. And when we think about the people we work with, most of us actually have a work family. Many of us are really connected with the people we work with. So they're more than just colleagues, but they might be colleagues or mentees or mentors. But we also can have connections with groups, sports or hobbies or other activities, including church. But again, I really want to emphasize that it's important, when we stay connected, to stay connected in a way that's comfortable for you. So Our last questions via Slido are these two. How do you stay in touch with friends and family? And who would be glad to hear from you, even if you haven't spoken for a while? Because we often struggle to stay connected with people if we haven't had regular contact with them. But of course, people love to hear from you. So, how do you stay in touch with family and friends? Is it via a regular WhatsApp meeting? Is it a regular coffee date? And who would you be glad to hear? Oh, who would be glad to hear from you? Okay, visiting my parents often. Great. Okay, sister, nephew, and nieces. Fantastic. Coffee catch ups. Yep, playing chess. Fantastic. WhatsApp conversations, phone calls. Yep. And when you've done this, can I just encourage you to send a quick SMS message to someone you're thinking of? Because the best way of actually changing our actions is by just doing something. So if after you've made a post or here, have a think about who you might want to reach out to and just send a quick message to say, hey, just thinking about you. Hope you're doing well. Okay, look, thank you very much, everybody. Those are the big five. I hope that's been a helpful exercise for you. Again, I recognize everybody has their own, if you like, magic big three or big five or big 10, but I hope this has been helpful. What I'd like to do is I'd like to start to close, but I just want to share some tips for using the big five. And probably a key point is that this is not a panacea. Life throws curveballs. People go up and down for lots of reasons. But what we've found consistently is that the Big Five helps people with resilience. It helps us to bounce back when times are tough. That's also a really nice way of enhancing good mental health for ourselves, for our families, for our friends, for the people we work with. If you go back to the checklist, you'll notice there's very little mention of mental health. It actually just looks like a very simple checklist. And what I find really helpful about the Big Five when I'm talking to people is that it builds on people's strengths. And it's also aligned with all good treatments. So you can use it with many different people. Now, people are struggling, and often there are reasons why we can't do our usual activities. It may be because of accident or injury or illness or other circumstances. Then just modify the activities. Instead of necessarily going out, you might want to do something staying indoors. You may want to do indoor yoga as opposed to going out. There are things often which we can do to modify our usual activities to ensure we get our dose of Big Five. Now, one thing I say to people when they're struggling and they're starting to recover is that it usually takes a few days for people to notice improvements. But it's really nice to think of the Big Five, as a simple way of giving people permission to be the best version of themselves. So, how do you apply the Big Five? Well, use the checklist. We've got a version of the checklist on our fridge, and we refer to it on a regular basis. Target the areas in red, and it's okay. We're all going to have times when we fall into the red for various reasons. Mostly on the red for social connections. And as soon as I realize that, I realize I'm perhaps a little bit grumpy, and I make connections and reach out to a couple of buddies. And before I know it, I'm back in the green. But a key point is build on your strengths. And if someone's really struggling, we encourage people to do one simple extra action each day and then increase as they build confidence. Now, a simple way of doing more of the Big Five is to combine actions. So rather than do something yourself, plan to do things with other people. That way, you're combining social connections with goals and plans and meaningful activities. It's a bit of a cheat sheet option, but it's a really nice way to keep moving and get moving. And I really do encourage people to just check the checklist on a weekly basis. Now, just a key point I know this may sound a bit unusual coming from a psychologist, but don't overthink it. I think in mental health, we probably talk far too much about things. And at the end of the day, change comes and improvement comes when we change our behaviors. And of course, it's important to reach out if you need help. Now, there are free copies of the Big Five at the MindSpot website, and we'll make those links available. But in summary, our key messages include, just like our physical health, our daily actions affect our mental health. And the work that we've done show that doing more of the Big Five can improve our mental health. Restricting the Big Five can trigger symptoms, and doing the Big Five at least 4 to 5 days of the week helps support our mental health. And our results show the Big Five are important regardless of culture or background or age. And I'll leave you with the key message, which is the Big Five. Do the Big Five each day. Keep the psychologist away. All right. I don't think we'll have time to show this video. What I would like to do is close by acknowledging the Big Five team and our collaborators across many countries, but also thank WAFA for their kind support of the Big Five over the years. I really want to also acknowledge that if people are struggling, there are free mental health services, including MindSpot. But in the time we have available before we move to questions, I'd like to hand across to my colleague, Anthea, who'll share some information about MindSpot GP. So Anthea, thank you for your patience. I'll hand across to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate the opportunity that you're giving us to share some information about our services. So for those who've never heard of us, we do have a clinical service. If you're working with clients who do require a little bit more psychological support, we can certainly be a pathway for you. And for those who are aware, this is a bit of a reminder for you. So we do operate in WA a clinical service called MindSpot GP. We do prefer a GP referral because we are fully funded by WAFA to offer that pathway to our GP colleagues. Certainly, people need to be 16 years and above, living in WA, and be financially or geographically challenged with accessing another service. We do work across the whole state. So we are a statewide service, and we have very strong partnerships with the local integrated primary mental health partners across the state. And in Perth, we also have a partnership with ORS. So we're certainly working in a collaborative way across the state. Couple of referral options there, just to remind you. We have referral forms in practice software, but you can also go to our webpage and download a form there. Certainly, we provide our services primarily by telephone and also an online option with optional weekly phone calls. So it's really about expanding access across the state to engage in some short-term CBT informed practice. With a GP referral, we also send out an assessment report and also a discharge summary as well. So we're keeping that GP fully informed of the journey through our treatment. For those, and particularly mindful of those living very regionally, there may not be a doctor close by. You can certainly self-refer, so you can direct your clients to our webpage. There's a yellow button you can see there. It says Start Your Assessment. Anyone aged 18 years and above across Australia can access our self-referral pathway. Just means that we don't have a GP that will keep informed of their treatment, and people can kind of take their own time to go through the program. I think I'll hand it back over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Anthea, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I appreciate that we are almost out of time, but I'm really happy to answer any questions and also take questions offline if that's helpful.
Based on your research, what have you noticed about how people's engagement with the Big Five changes over time, particularly during setbacks or relapses, and what seems to help people re-engage without feeling like they failed?
Okay, so the question is around what do we notice when people are using the Big Five or stop using the Big Five and then potentially feel guilty? What's important to acknowledge, and this is something we talk to people about, is that we're all a work in progress. The Big Five are not magical. They're actually practical things that we all do, but because of life circumstances, it's quite understandable that there are times when we do less of the big five, when we're under pressure with work, when we become physically unwell, we have an accident, for people who are fly-in, fly-outs. For a whole lot of reasons, we can stop doing the big five or do less of them. Now, I do emphasize to people that it's rare for people never to do the big five. If people are struggling, it usually means they've slowed down some of the big five. And just like everything else, you start again, or you do a little bit more, and we normalize that experience for people. And our experience overwhelmingly is that most people find that a really helpful message, that is, they're not alone, and that is, recovery is possible, but sometimes people need a little bit more support. So I hope that that's answered that question.
People already experiencing burnout.
Okay, so how can the big five be presented in a way that reduces defensiveness? That's a great question. Much like other activities, it's often the case of people knowing again that they're not alone and that they're not weak. And our experience clinically is that often people need to be heard. They need to feel validated that they are experiencing a difficult time and that it's understandable and it's not their fault. And our experience is when people have an opportunity to be heard like that, to be validated, then they're often ready to move on. We all know from our clinical experience that we can't tell people what to do until they're ready to do it. But the good thing with the big five is that we're not asking people to do things they don't want to do. We're asking people to do more of the things which they used to do, and which are good for them. And when they're ready, they can start doing those things. But often the first step is not about the big five. It's actually about respectfully listening to people, validating their experience. And then when they've had that experience of catharsis and validation, they're ready to move on.
So
Mm.
tends to be the most impactful when someone
Mm.
can realistically only start with one.
Oh yeah, great question. Yeah. So what happens when people are really overwhelmed and literally have no time? I like to encourage people to start off with either meaningful activities, that is, doing something they enjoy doing. Now, it could be as simple as watching 5 minutes of a show or listening to a favorite piece of music. And a reason for that is it shifts people's mindset from feeling overwhelmed to actually thinking, oh gosh, I quite enjoyed that. Now, people can combine that sometimes with other activities. So if they're driving somewhere, they can listen to a podcast, or they're traveling somewhere. So there are ways of supporting people to build in some of the big five into their usual routines. Likewise, another really nice activity is for people to reach out to somebody, give someone a call, which they can sometimes do if they're in transit, obviously safely. So if they're driving, they'll have to be hands-free. But people who reach out to others, and that can be as simple as an SMS message. Within minutes, if they receive a response, it's really reinforcing. So they get a nice endorphin rush from that, but importantly, they feel connected, and that can again support people just to have a little bit of relief. Mm. Look, there's ongoing research, I believe, the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. As I mentioned, there's research and practice actually happening with the Big Five in, to my knowledge, 17 countries, but I suspect it's more than that now. So we're sharing results around the Big Five. I won't say early because everything is being published, but you'll be hearing more about it. But we know colleagues in Sweden, I suspect in other places, are using the big five with people with comorbidities. My understanding is that the results are really promising. Again, it's not a panacea, but it is helping people regulate. their emotional well-being. But look, we have to take that one on notice because the results aren't out formally yet.
That's the close of our webinar. So I thank Nick and Anthony for joining us today, and for you guys as well for jumping online and being ever so patient with us as well. I have popped up on the screen a QR code, and I've just put a link in the chat to our feedback survey for the webinar as well. If you could just take a few minutes of your time just to fill that out for us, that'd be great. And we hope that you're able to get some meaningful insights from today's presentation. And we will also be emailing you some post-event resources as well as the slides used today, so that you have that to refer to as well. So thank you for joining us, and we wish you a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you.